If you think spring stiffness is just about some understeer or oversteer, you're missing almost everything what can make a car fast. You might not care about car setups, but guess what? You're always driving one. And once you can see spring stiffness actually does to your car behavior, you will stop fighting, be more informed, have more knowledge on how to drive your particular car. I've been sim racing for years, have been obsessed with car setup theory in all different simulators. I've built my own car setup store and different car setup products on my website, and this is how I see spring stiffness. Let's get into it. Throughout this video, I will talk about tire overload and tire load sensitivity. It means the more pressure we push on a tire, the less effective the grip will be. So it's not reducing the grip when you push tire load on it, but the effectiveness disappears. And tire load is always bad. You want the least amount of it. That's why light cars and wide cars are typically faster than heavy small cars because of this effect. And this is something that will keep coming back in the video. So go back to this section and read these words to see what tire load means and how it affects the overall grip levels. To understand springs, we are going to do this very simple example, which is you have let's say you were driving a certain speed on track and you hit the brakes, and then the front of the car pitches and you get some tire load on the front wheels. You can see how the front spring is compressing and the front of the car body starts to pitch a little bit. When you have a softer front spring, this changes. It creates more pitch because the simple stiffness of that spring is allowing the car body to dive more, and it has a huge effect on multiple things that I'm gonna explain in this video. When you hit brakes fully with soft or stiff springs, typically you'll find you got a lot of pitch with soft springs, and you got a tire that is loaded up a fraction of a bit later than the stiff spring. Because with the stiff spring under the harsh braking zone, you get less pitch of the car body. It might settle very quickly. And with the soft spring, the front pitch is gonna maybe take some time. The car is gonna dive. But overall, I do have these different colors on the tires, but overall, these tires are loaded up at the same way. So we don't change spring stiffness for a hard braking zone typically. Now we are trail braking, and now this tire load and pitch are starting to become noticeable because we have on the soft spring, we have more travel, like the wheel can move more freely in its travel because of the softer spring. You know, if there's just less force needed to make the tire comply with the track on both sides. But with the stiffer spring, it's just more harsh. So if you had, let's say you had a corner section, like a long corner section, and you were trail braking, and there was some banking, and there was some uneven surfaces on the road surface, a softer spring would create a tire that is more compliant and would have less burden of this tire load. And that's why, from a mechanical standpoint, you tend to feel a more grippy, pointy front car with a softer front spring. Going back to the point, softer front spring gives less understeer. However, the stiffer spring has less pitch also. So the stability under braking you're gonna have with a stiffer spring, because first, aerodynamically, we don't have a lot of pitch, and the front tires are kind of overloading a little bit. And by the way, these are small percentages, but they're very noticeable. We're tuning cars here. We're not gaining 3 seconds of lap time by just changing some spring stiffness. Again, I want to point out, when the tire is red, you were aiming towards this part of the grip tire load sensitivity graph. So meaning if the tires are green, they're a more efficient window. They just operate better, have more efficiency, and you get a little bit of a grip back on the tires. I want to keep going with this softer springs and stiffer springs, but now we're gonna introduce the rake of the car, we're gonna introduce speed states, and we're gonna assume a ride height of 70 millimeters, a front ride height of 50 millimeters, spring travel of 40 millimeters, and on the front and on the back. To understand aerodynamics from a really basic perspective is that this is gonna happen under different speeds. So we go 125 and we might have a little bit of spring travel because aerodynamics start to maybe minorly give a change. So think about the spring stiffness and the car body and the downforce. The car is going into its spring travel because of the airflow, and as we increase the speed, springs start to compress and start to compress and start to compress, and when we're driving 200 kilometers, there's so much airflow on the car with the front splitter underneath the car body and the diffuser pulling this 4 square box into a certain balance of the car. So you typically see this, something like this happening. So as we go faster, the aerodynamics start to shift, and imagine this blue box being the total amount of downforce that we're using. Now think about the width and the bigness of this blue box as the aerodynamics balance. So to change this box front and backwards is about ride height differences. So now we have 70 and 50. Okay, if I would do 80, then this complete box would shift more forward. It would push forward. By the way, in the description, I have a ride heights video. It explains Packer's spring travel all from an aerodynamic standpoint. So have a look if you want to go into this model. But I want to point out this model to understand these springs as well, because it's important. Now in the previous example with the yellow springs, meaning 50% springs or like the 50% of the slider, and now I want to go to this same situation with rake and a softer front spring, and what it means when you're driving a softer front spring from an aerodynamic standpoint. Before we went into a mechanical standpoint, now we take an aerodynamic standpoint. So think about this. So if and this depends on the spring and how the simulation, like iRacing, Le Mans Ultimate or whatever, it treats the spring stiffness and also the aerodynamics, how the game interprets it, because this is not reality. In reality, things might be completely different, but from all the car setup building, this is the best way I can come up with to understand it. So on the previous slide, you could see that when we have a speed of like 125 and we have a small amount of airflow in the car, imagine it would happen at 125, you can see now that my front spring is compressed 34 or has 34 millimeters and the rear has 35. So our rake on 125 have increased with 1 millimeters compared to the equal spring stiffness on the car. If I go faster and faster and faster, you can see that my rake is increasing as I'm going faster. Now, I'm totally ignoring the fact of load transfer under throttle. In reality, it would be more pointing backwards as a whole, but to avoid complexity, I would just wanted to explain you this from a steady speed state. So this is a steady speed state of 175, and this is going to come back. And you can see my rake has now increased by 5 millimeters compared to the other spring setup where we had equal springs. So now we have, let's say we were trail braking at this point, 175. Now we have more aerodynamic balance on the front, and we have better compliant front springs. And that's why a spring change is so significant on car balance, because it is influenced aerodynamically and mechanically. So if we go faster, let's say we get 200 and we're trail braking again, now we might have, or we have a steady speed, now we might have 30 millimeters of rake. Now there is always this idea of rake is too much rake would upset the rear diffuser, and we could have a bunch of oversteer now on a certain moment on the track. Sometimes when we get excessive amounts of rake, it is also caused by this soft front spring. Now this is something interesting, and I really feel that on some cars, and I saw it on some telemetry, that when we speed up more, aerodynamics are going to be so dominant, and at this point the rake might disappear as well, because we have so much airflow that also the stiff spring might compress. And now we have the same aerodynamic balance. So again, with a soft spring, we might have 5 millimeters of rake on 175, and with a stiff spring, we might have 20 millimeters of rake. So from an aerodynamic standpoint, and this is a little bit of the hybrid area, we got a more compliant front tires compared to the rear, and we have more aerodynamics on the front of the car. If you're liking this content this far, could you please hit that like button and let me know what you think of this video, because I'm constantly trying to improve these videos and explanations, and I see some really smart people sometimes in the comments, and I do really learn from that as well, so let me know. So the current examples I made was from steady speed states and cornering in general. We're absolutely not driving 175 all the time. It is constantly evolving, changing. We're using the steering wheel, and we have load transfer and throttle, brake input, steering inputs, all this stuff working together. So how can we understand this model even better, and how to understand this front spring change, which we're still talking about? So from a steady speed cornering, so imagine we were coasting a little bit, obviously car balance is going to be changed by differential and how everything works. Look at this pink, this is load transfer. And I don't know, in the previous video somebody said that I somehow gave the suggestion that we can change load transfer. We don't. Load transfer happens regardless. Stiffer springs, softer springs, load transfer of car body is always happening, okay? But with different spring settings compared to front and right, we get a different balance. To go back to the overload example, what we explained earlier, on this situation we have the soft spring, so we have a more compliant wheel over here. I'm just painting this green. This is pointing out more efficiency. But the rear tire, because load transfer is here anyway, now this tire needs to pick up the load. Okay, so this rear tire is under a more heavy burden than the front. What does this mean? This rear tire is more exposed to tire load sensitivity and overload, so this might have a reduction of grip, and this might have an increase of grip. And then we add the aerodynamic box to it, and this creates the car to be more grippy on the front tire. When we go to the front other example where we have the stiffer front spring, we might have a better balance on these both wheels. This tire has a certain tire load sensitivity, and this one as well. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that one is quicker than the other, but we have a more neutral balance over here. So if my driving style wasn't really implying trail braking or whatever, we could have some understeer here, but another guy might be absolutely thriving with this setup. For me, personally, I like this more, because when we have an equal load transfer on both tires, we have basically more grip to spend. In this situation, we're upsetting the rear and we're really optimizing the front. But do you want cars to have an equal balance most of the time to get most performance out of the tire? But that's the thing, right? What if you don't like this behavior in your driving style? You might aim towards a front or front spring. Let's move on, because we're not finished yet. A little bit of a side note, if you see these differences between spring stiffnesses and on the rear spring stiffness, you can think about spring stiffness that spring stiffness will change mechanically the grip on the front. So front softer means more oversteer, and stiffer on the rear means more oversteer as well. But with anti-roll bars, for instance, you don't change it aerodynamically. So if you would want to ignore the aerodynamic behavior from pitching and squatting of the ride heights, then anti-roll bar is your solution, because it doesn't change this. It changes the stability and the strength of this blue box from sideways behavior for like adding more body roll to the car. Something I wanted to point out. So what if we were braking? Now load transfer also goes to the front. So imagine that the front left now needs to take up all the burden, okay? On this scenario, with the stiffer rear spring, this front tire might be picking up more load. But this is not necessarily from a steady point. This is from a complete corner section. So when we bleed off brakes, this aerodynamics going to have less effect. There might be some banking on tracks, and that's what's representing the overload. So let's say you have a really harsh bump in a corner, then you get a certain amounts of this tire load sensitivity load on this tire, creating the understeer. However, with the soft spring and trail braking, we might create a situation where we got too much rake, and we can get the following effect. In this situation where we're braking still, the rear tires might upset because of the aerodynamics on 175. We're trail braking here, and that could create the oversteer, and you would spin. And when we have a stiffer spring, that would create a less aerodynamic forces on this aero box over here, and from a mechanical standpoint, this front tire needs to pick up so much load, and that would create the understeer. So let's get into some practical advice. By the way, I set these setups on Le Mans Ultimate and ACC as well. I set them up in different levels. So I got like a 5.6, for instance. This is a very aggressive setup for my doing. It's gonna have like a different spring setup, different rake setup to make the cars more aggressive and more safe. I'm using these levels myself all the time because sometimes I might spin or I make the setups a lot. I do a lot of driving later, and then I'll think, oh man, I need to do a different level. So let's talk about this. So from an aerodynamic and mechanical standpoint, I found this rake and this spring stiffness on this car particular very nice for Spa to do fast corner behavior and get the mid-speed balance with spring stiffness. So I explained before in the video that we got the spring rates on the soft and let's say something like this, okay? So I was talking about 50% and 100%. This is being 100% stiffness. This is like 0% stiffness. So 50%, I was talking about 3 and 3, okay? So on this particular setup, it's different, but let's talk about the example in the video. Like, what if I've changed this? Now we have that same story as I explained the video, because that will bring the aero box more forward. We have more mechanical grip throughout the corner section on the front axle, but we might pitch a lot and get some oversteer left and right in the mid-speed corners. On this setup, however, we got it a little bit differently. So think about spring rates on the front on 4 and spring rate on the back on the rear. Now that model about speed completely changed the other way around as we go faster. So on the setup that I explained in the previous part of the McLaren, you got like this area with this car that we got the rake increase under these different speeds, but on the McLaren it's the other way around. You think about stiffer front springs and softer rear springs, that the rake is kind of like balancing backwards, and you got more efficient tires on the back, and that really helped out the balance of that car in particular. Now, understanding this concept is nice, but like, where do you go from this and how to tweak it? How do you then incorporate this in your setup builds and how to actually do it yourself? Well, you need a system, a 7-step system, and you can see here the steps that I take when building my own car setup. So you can have a look here, the high speed balance, which we do with rake, because that will set the end balance typically on cars. Then we go to step 3, where we change the spring travel, so the amount of travel the spring can go. By the way, I have also a video in the description on the first 2 steps you need to take to completely build your own car setups. It starts with wing settings, ride heights, spring travel, and then you can get into the fine balancing of spring stiffness with like different steps and all that stuff. So check that also out in the description. This is a premium product, so if you really want to get into car setups and you want to build them yourself, you can have a look in the description. the thing is with this is been keeping this product is keeping these videos alive because it's supporting my family and it's a complete clear system to exercise setup in a very, like, at least I think a very clear way, and more than 80 people have already gotten this, so that support has been absolutely amazing. You will also get into a private Discord with car setup reports and contact with me if you have any questions or you really want to get into more detail. Now, if you want more explanations on the McLaren, I created this video with different car setup levels and how the cars are set up for Silverstone, again with the same model explanation, because I can imagine that some people don't want to buy stuff, but this video could also give you a really clear way on how this Aero box model interprets with like high speed behavior, packers and all that good stuff. And that video will be right up here. Thanks for watching.